This week, I want to start a two-part series on how business transformation can fix motivation in your organization. And it kind of initiated from a Harvard Business Review article that basically stated that executives of large organizations and for the survey it was an average size of I think like $13 billion. Um, that executives are isolated from their front line. That only 6% of the time executives spend is on the front line, 3% with customers, and 72% in meetings, of course. Um, and that to me is really backwards when I see that. Most organizations I work with are closer to, say, 20 to 30% of their time where they're spending time with customers and the front line where customers interact with their organization. And even in large organizations, it obviously gets more complicated with once you achieve 150 employees. But once you get to 10,000, 20,000 plus employees, then the more isolated you become as an executive. And, you know, my observation is that executives spend practically zero time with the front line. And customer spending 3% seems about right, depending on how you define that. And then, you know, the larger the organization, the worse this gets, as far as isolation goes. And, I've often asked executives, why um, they don't spend more time, at the front line and understanding work. And you know, there's several reasons, but the ones I hear probably most is, they don't want to cause a stir in the organization. Again, as a larger organization gets, they become like celebrities. And but the issue there is just like when you have your roadies, when you have, let's say, Taylor Swift, you know, you get to know these people, and then it's not quite as intimidating, right? But that's the other reason is, or another reason is, they're afraid they're going to intimidate the front line, and they do at the beginning. I'm not denying that. Other excuses I've heard is, I'm working on bigger problems, the strategy, I'm spending time with customers, which usually isn't true, other than maybe taking them to a basketball game or a football game or something. Um, and I know that's time spent with customer, uh, but not the type that's going to get you to understand how your organization is put together. Um, and so how does this impact motivation? These things. Well, if you're an out of touch executive making decisions from the hierarchy, uh, about frontline work, it's demotivating to people on the front line because they're like, why did they make that decision? And immediately that's almost one of the first things you hear. They won't tell the executive that, but they'll tell me, why did they make that type of decision? Um, and I often at the beginning of these things, I encourage them to ask the executive, what's going on there. So um, I not particularly. Um, it's, it's I try to point out to executives the delta between what uh, executives think they understand about the front line and customers and the way it really works. and that delta is super large. And the reason being is that they get most of their information from reports. Um, they're trusted informants, as I like to call them, and then past and previous experience that they had. Maybe they worked, something like that job in that organization, or maybe even another organization, or they have previous experience with a different organization as an executive, and they can draw all types of false conclusions, and that's the best way I can put it. Most executives do not have a grasp of the reality of what's happening on the front line. And I can tell you, when I take executives to the front line and they start listening to calls and they start observing what's going on in their organization, the first thing that comes to their mind is they're just not employees aren't doing it right. If there's a problem. And most are really appreciative at the same time. But they'll say, well, they aren't following the procedure or whatever. And oftentimes I find the executive doesn't really understand how their system is cobbled together from a series of functional misfit policies and rules and things of that sort. And so the only way to really get to understand that is to see it and to listen to what's going on at the front line. And, it starts by breaking this down, starts by observing your organizational customer in by the executive, getting to understand your organization as a system. And so the solution really becomes that showing up at the front line to get a sense of what's really happening in your organization. And, it is scary and intimidating for both the front line and the executives. I can tell you, executives, sometimes they're a bull in a china shop when they go in. Like I said, they say, oh, they aren't doing it right. But that's not the point. The point is to understand how the system is working, not how you think it should be working. And so, it is scary, intimidating, and getting frontline employees to be okay with sitting with an executive, to have them listen to their call or their interaction with customers is a nerve-wracking thing. But if you continue to show up, it just becomes part of what happens within the organization. And then this is what replaces 90% of the reports that you get, the need for the informants to come to your office and tell you what's going on, and replaces the past and previous experiences that you had with pragmatically what's happening in your organization, the reality of what it is, of what's going on. And what I find is this act by itself will break down the barriers between the front line and executives and increase the motivation of employees, because they're like, oh, they relate to, now they understand. I've been saying this for, and oftentimes it's years, to the different executives, within the organization. This person finally came in, or this group of executives finally came in and really wants to understand what's happening. And it's more than just a conciliatory act on the part of an executive. It really changes what's happening and how you see the organization. But you also get the added benefit of getting that better understanding, of seeing the system at work, or in a good way and a bad way, because you're going to get a lot of both. And it's enlightening when you do that. And it makes me think of, I kind of laugh at the Undercover Boss. type of thing. But I don't think you should be undercover. I think you should do it out in the open. That becomes really a touchstone for you. And when you keep showing up, the fear that might exist by virtue of you showing up in the organization goes away. But you got to do it regularly, and you have to do it with purpose, because otherwise it's a waste of your time, ultimately. And so really, this is the first part I wanted to get into about how you can solve the motivation problem through business transformation. But there's a whole slew of other things, obviously, that you get by spending time with the front line and that interaction between customers and your organization. It's irreplaceable, no matter how big your company is. And I can tell you, I've had CEOs of very large companies that have done this, and it's become a part of their routine that they do, either weekly, potentially monthly, but a certain amount of their time is spent getting a pragmatic reality check in their organization about how things really run. So that's the end of the first part. And the second part, I'll get into, how you can leverage this information and business transformation into getting the motivation and the morale and everything else in your organization to really skyrocket. And I've never had any problem, making that happen, because the system that I have is built around breaking down all of these types of barriers. So anyway, that's what I wanted to cover this week. And remember, there is always a better way.